I will not let you disguise bigotry as free speech. Not here, not tonight. The hall fell silent. Hundreds of eyes shifted from Zohran Mamdani, standing firm behind the wooden podium, to Joe Rogan, who leaned back in his chair with a smirk. The lights overhead hummed, cameras clicked, and the tension thickened into something almost unbearable. The community hall in Brooklyn had been chosen as a neutral space. Rogan, riding on the popularity of his podcast empire, had come insisting he wanted an honest conversation. Mamdani, however, saw through the framing. He knew this wasn't just a discussion, it was a trial staged for an audience that wanted spectacle, and Zohran had just delivered the first blow. "Tell me, Joe," he continued, his voice sharper now, cutting through the nervous murmurs of the crowd, "when you joke about marginalized people, when you platform hate, is that freedom, or is that cowardice dressed up as courage?" The room stirred again. Some cheered, others booed, and somewhere in the middle sat people who had only come to watch, now realizing they were witnessing the start of a scandal that would ripple far beyond these walls. Rogan leaned forward, microphone catching his chuckle. "Cowardice? That's rich, coming from a politician. You think you're brave because you stand at a podium? Because you shout the loudest? Let's be real. People came here for the truth, not your moral lectures." But Mamdani didn't flinch. His hand rested calmly on the podium, his face steady, his eyes locked on Rogan. And that steadiness made Rogan uneasy. The crowd erupted into whispers, questions flying like sparks. Was Mamdani going too far? Would Rogan manage to twist his words back on him? And what exactly was the line between truth-telling and provocation? The stakes were visible on every face in that hall. College students leaned forward, notebooks ready. Journalists scribbled madly in the back rows. Neighborhood activists clutched their signs, some in support of Zohran, others prepared to defend Rogan. Zohran raised his voice once more, not with rage, but with conviction. "We live in a country where inequality is broadcast daily, yet the loudest microphones are used to laugh at the very people suffering most. You call that honesty? I call it a betrayal of the public trust." Rogan shifted in his chair, tapping the table. "So you're saying people can't laugh anymore? That comedians like me should be censored because you don't like the punchline?" A roar rose from the audience, some shouting, "Yes," others, "No," but Zohran raised his hand and the noise quieted. "No one here is against laughter," he replied firmly. "But when your laughter silences the pain of millions, when your stage becomes a shield for those who already hold power, then what you call comedy is nothing but a weapon. And I'm not afraid to call it what it is." Gasps filled the hall. Reporters' pens scratched faster. The confrontation had moved beyond banter. It was now a clash of values, a test of how far each man would go. And beneath it all lingered the unspoken question: who would walk away the hero of this night? The scandal was already unfolding, but no one knew how deep it would cut. If you're following along, don't forget, share your thoughts in the comments. Whose side are you on so far? And subscribe if you want to see how this battle plays out. This is just the beginning. The sound of feet shifting echoed through the community hall. The air was thick with expectation. People weren't just watching a debate anymore. They were watching two men fight for control of the room itself. Joe Rogan leaned closer to his microphone, eyes narrowing. "Zohran, let's cut through the performance. You're not here to protect people's feelings. You're here because you want to score points, make headlines, and look like the hero. Isn't that right?" The words landed heavy, but Zohran didn't flinch. He scanned the hall, saw the faces staring back at him. Students, workers, elders, activists, people who had come not just for entertainment, but for answers. Then he answered slowly, deliberately. "Do you think I care about headlines, Joe? I grew up walking through neighborhoods where landlords treated families like disposable furniture. I've sat with mothers who cried because their kids couldn't afford medicine. You think this is theater? This is my life. This is their life, and I will not let you make it into a punchline." The applause cracked like thunder. People rose to their feet, clapping and shouting his name. Yet just as quickly, Rogan's supporters began booing, some shouting back, others waving their hands dismissively. The hall became a storm. Rogan smirked, but his voice carried an edge now. "You act like I'm the villain here. All I do is talk. People choose to listen. Isn't that freedom? Isn't that democracy?" Mamdani fired back without hesitation. "Freedom is not when the loudest voice drowns out the weakest. Democracy is not when profit decides who gets to speak. Tell me, Joe, what's the price of your freedom? How many dollars for each insult that keeps you trending? How many downloads for every stereotype you let slip through your microphone?" The crowd gasped again. The scandal was no longer about a clash of opinion. It was becoming a public trial of Rogan's influence. Reporters scribbled faster, camera flashes burned across the stage, and the audience buzzed with restless energy. A man near the back shouted, "Answer him, Rogan," while another yelled, "Let the man speak." The room was a battlefield of words and loyalties. For the first time, Rogan looked unsettled. He leaned back, adjusting his headphones, and let out a forced laugh. "So what? You want to control who speaks, who jokes, who gets a platform? Sounds like censorship to me, and I thought you were supposed to stand for the people." Zohran's reply cut through the hall like glass. The people are not asking to be laughed at. They are asking to be heard. And if the best defense you have is to call their dignity censorship, then maybe you're afraid of what happens when truth speaks louder than you. A silence swept the hall, short, sharp, and electric. The words hung in the air like a challenge no one could ignore. The scandal was deepening, and with every sentence, Mamdani was painting himself not just as a politician, but as a defender of something larger: dignity, justice, humanity itself. Rogan shifted again, trying to wrestle back control. "Okay, Zohran, let's test this. If your vision is so strong, tell these people, what does your version of freedom look like? What's the alternative to what I do? Because right now, I don't hear a plan. I just hear outrage." The question cracked the tension open. Heads turned, pens stopped mid-scribble. The audience leaned forward. Zohran tightened his grip on the podium, his voice calm, almost steady as stone. "My version of freedom is when a kid in Brooklyn can walk into school without fearing hunger or eviction. My version of freedom is when an immigrant family isn't told they're a joke, but recognized as neighbors, as contributors, as equals. And my version of freedom is when we stop calling cruelty entertainment and start calling it what it is: exploitation." The eruption of cheers was deafening. Students shouted his name. Workers pumped their fists in the air. Even those who came uncertain now found themselves leaning toward his side. The scandal was no longer a whisper. It was now the roar of a crowd. And in the middle of it all, one truth was becoming clear. Zohran Mamdani wasn't backing down. This battle was far from over. And if you're still watching, take a second to subscribe. Add your thoughts below. Do you believe freedom should have limits? Or is everything fair game? Your voice matters in this conversation. The hall had turned into a storm, but Joe Rogan wasn't done. He leaned forward, fists pressed against the table, eyes fixed on Zohran Mamdani like a fighter who had just taken a punch but was ready to swing back. "You're a smooth talker, Zohran," Rogan said, his voice sharper now, less casual, more combative. "But here's the truth. People are sick of being told what they can and can't say. They're sick of politicians acting like moral referees. That's why they listen to me. Because I say what they're thinking, even if it's ugly. Isn't that honesty? Isn't that real freedom?" A wave of applause rippled through his supporters in the audience, followed by jeers from the other side. The divide in the room was like a crack, splitting concrete, threatening to widen until the hall itself broke apart. Zohran stood still, but his silence wasn't weakness, it was preparation. He let Rogan's words hang, let the cheers burn out, let the moment weigh heavy. And then he spoke. "You call it honesty when you profit from prejudice. You call it freedom when you punch down on the powerless. But tell me this, Joe, if honesty means mocking the vulnerable and freedom means amplifying cruelty, then what kind of society are we building? Who actually wins in your version of America?" The words struck harder than before. Even those who had cheered Rogan now looked uncertain, shifting uncomfortably in their seats. A young woman in the front row raised her hand and shouted, "Answer him!" Her voice cracked with urgency, like she was speaking for more than just herself. Rogan bristled. He laughed, but it was hollow. "Who wins? The audience wins. People get to hear unfiltered conversations, not speeches written to impress voters. They come to me because they're tired of politicians like you, who paint everything in black and white. Life's messy. People joke, people offend. That's reality." Zohran leaned forward on the podium, his voice steady but edged with fire. "Reality is not a joke when you're the one being crushed by it. Reality is eviction notices, low wages, racial slurs, broken healthcare. And when you laugh at those realities, Joe, you don't reflect them. You erase them. You make them invisible. And invisibility is the cruelest silence of all." The hall shook with thunderous applause. Even some who had clapped for Rogan earlier now found themselves moved, caught in the weight of Zohran's words. Rogan tried to interrupt, but Zohran pressed on, his voice gaining momentum. "You ask about freedom? Freedom is not measured by how loudly the strong can shout. Freedom is measured by how clearly the weak can speak and be heard. And every time you turn their pain into a punchline, you're telling them their voice doesn't matter. That is not freedom. That is domination dressed up as entertainment." The words were heavy, unrelenting, and they landed with a force that filled the hall with silence. Cameras zoomed closer, reporters leaned in. The crowd seemed to collectively hold its breath. Then, from the back of the hall, a man shouted, "He's right!" The ripple spread. Others clapped, others stood, and suddenly the hall leaned toward Mamdani like a tide shifting toward the shore. Rogan's jaw tightened. For the first time, he looked less like the confident provocateur and more like a man cornered, searching for a way out. He forced a laugh. "So what? You want me cancelled? You want me shut down, banned, erased? That's the slippery slope, Zohran. That's why people fight against voices like yours. Because you pretend to defend freedom, but really, you're just another censor in a suit." The accusation landed like a dagger, but Mamdani caught it with ease. I don't want you cancelled, Joe. I want you accountable. There's a difference. Cancellation is about erasing voices. Accountability is about asking, what do you use your voice for? Do you use it to build or to break? To heal or to humiliate? That's the question you keep dodging. The crowd erupted again, louder than ever. Chants of Zohran, Zohran filled the hall, echoing against the walls, shaking the stage. And in that moment, it became clear to everyone watching. This wasn't just a debate anymore. This was a reckoning, a scandal that had burst into the open and was now pulling Rogan's empire into its gravity. But it was also something more, the birth of a new image for Zohran Mamdani. Not just a politician, but a fighter, unafraid to challenge even the biggest microphone in America. The night was reaching its breaking point, and both men knew it. And if you're still here, don't just watch. Be part of the conversation. Drop your thoughts in the comments, subscribe for more, and let your voice be heard. Because this battle is far from finished. The chants still echoed, Zohran, Zohran, as Joe Rogan leaned forward, gripping his microphone like a weapon, his face flushed with frustration, but his voice tried to mask it with sarcasm. So that's it then? You're the saint, I'm the sinner? You've got the answers, I've got the problems? You think the people watching this are going to buy that? Mamdani didn't raise his voice. Instead, he let silence linger, then spoke softly, and somehow, the softness made the hall lean closer. I don't need to be a saint, Joe. I just need to be honest. And honesty is telling people that words matter, that voices matter, that we can choose to lift each other up instead of tearing each other down. Isn't that what real courage looks like? The crowd erupted again, not in chaotic bursts this time, but in waves of steady applause, like a drumbeat of agreement. Rogan shifted, his usual confidence fraying at the edges. And what happens when people don't agree with your version of truth? When their reality doesn't match yours? You going to label them all villains too? Zohran's eyes locked on him. Disagreement is healthy. Debate is necessary. But when disagreement becomes dehumanization, when debate becomes exploitation, that's when we have to draw the line. And tonight, I'm drawing it. The hall fell quiet. Even Rogan's supporters, restless and defensive just moments ago, seemed subdued. The weight of Mamdani's words was undeniable. A woman in the audience stood up, her voice trembling as she called out, "Thank you. Thank you for saying what so many of us feel but can't say." Others followed, clapping, cheering, shouting his name until the noise filled every corner of the hall. Rogan tried to interject, "This is a setup. This is politics dressed as morality." But the sound was swallowed by the rising tide of voices. The scandal had spun out of his control, and everyone could see it. Zohran raised his hand, quieting the room once more. His final words carried not just conviction, but something deeper, hope. We are not here to cancel anyone. We are here to remind ourselves that power without responsibility is dangerous, that freedom without compassion is empty, and that the real strength of a society isn't measured by how loudly one man speaks into a microphone. It's measured by how many voices are finally heard. The hall erupted in standing ovation. Students cheered, workers raised their fists, elders nodded with pride. The cameras caught it all. The moment Rogan's smirk faded into silence, and Zohran Mamdani stood, not just as a politician in Brooklyn, but as a symbol of resistance, of integrity, of leadership. It was no longer just a debate. It was a scandal that exposed the cracks in celebrity power, and a triumph that revealed the strength of conviction. As reporters rushed forward, as chants filled the air, as the night story prepared to ripple across headlines and feeds, one truth had already been written. Zohran Mamdani had walked into the lion's den and emerged as the hero. The image would last. The wooden podium, the floodlights, the crowded hall, and one man standing firm against a storm. And for those watching at home, the choice was clear. Whose side are you on? Don't just leave this moment behind. Add your voice to the conversation in the comments. Subscribe if you believe debates like this matter, because the fight for truth, for dignity, for freedom, it isn't ending here. It's only beginning.